This is Robert Martellacci, the MindShare Learning Report, Canada's Learning and Technology e-magazine. And welcome to This Week in Canadian EdTech special edition. I'm honored to have join me for a MindShare Learning Moment, Tracey Burns, the Senior Analyst, Directorate for Education and Skills at the OECD. Dr. Burns received her PhD from Northeastern University and is actually a Canadian who's a graduate of McGill University and did her postdoc at UBC. Thank you for joining me this morning, your afternoon, Tracey, in these challenging times.
It's my pleasure. I should warn you that the connection is a little bit patchy, so if I'm hesitating a bit, it's due to the connection. But I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you so much for your time. What got my interest was, as an analyst, you wrote a report on responding to the coronavirus back to school. We've seen many challenges and some excellent adaptation to remote learning in Canada. And we've been sharing best practices and success stories. And part of our inspiration, and this podcast is brought to you by C21 Canada, Canadians for 21st Century Learning and Innovation, is to really illuminate what's happening nationally, internationally, and locally to help support teaching and learning and best practices. I hope you and your family are well. I mean, Paris is a tough assignment to be in, but you've been kind of housebound for a while. We spent time in Paris a couple of years ago. My son was on an exchange, and I absolutely enjoyed it. But how are you doing, and what's life like currently for students in France as well?
Yeah, well, so Paris is very different than those of you who are familiar with it would recognize. We've been under lockdown since the middle of March. So all the cafes and restaurants closed, and the famous nightlife and all the lovely lively cafes are no longer open. In terms of student life, students were working from home for the vast majority. There were some exceptions for students who were children of essential workers, and also certain students in very particular circumstances who were still able to go to school during the lockdown. But on the whole, for 2 months, from the 11th of March to the 11th of May, France was online. Education in France was online. And starting on Monday, the 11th of May, the youngest students started to go back to school.
Thank you for that. Perhaps you can talk a little bit about your role at the OECD and Education Directorate. And we've had Andrea Sliker, your Director General, present at a couple of our conferences in the past. He provides some amazing insight and inspiration around the future of learning. And you've taken a real leadership role globally in supporting some of the challenges that we're going through in these unprecedented times.
Yeah, I mean, it's really been something that has well, as you know, has caught the world completely by surprise. The OECD, along with UNESCO and our partners in other international organizations, have done what we can to step up and help support students and teachers and education systems around the world, not just for being there and helping with immediate questions, but also by collecting the experiences of countries and allowing them to learn from each other, which is one of the things we can do well, and which has been really helpful for countries that were a little bit later in the process than those who started off at the very beginning. So it's been a very frantic time, a very busy time, but it feels very good to be useful and to be able to share those experiences and give a platform for countries to talk about what they're doing, and not just what they're doing well, but also what they're challenged by.
Right. And perhaps you can, there are many challenges with teacher professional learning and readiness to be synchronously teaching. The equity challenge comes into play in a big way that's being addressed. One of the things that, we talk about here is the readiness for avoiding this sort of thing in the future. And part of our EdTech Summit in the fall is going to be addressing emergency preparedness planning. School districts prepare for the potential for the school district building to be shut down, by whatever, and the servers going down and the remote, and redundancy. But no one ever has planned for, like cities do, a disaster management strategy, like our city here in Mississauga has an overall city disaster management strategy for the best interests of the people. So if you take that concept and translate it to education, it's for the teachers and students. And how do we sustain learning?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And this is actually something that it's an unfortunate and sort of unprecedented event, but in a way it's been one of the shocks that future thinkers have been warning about for years, and one of the questions has been, somebody said, well, how did we get hit by the train we all saw coming for 30 years? Because every futures thinking exercise you did as a strategic group, whether it be business or education or ministry, included, global pandemic, what would happen if? But the bottom line is that we're all busy people. Educators are busy people. There are limited resources, and planning ahead for these kinds of extremely rare but disruptive events has not been as much a priority as the day-to-day of everyday schooling, which is a decision I totally understand. I think what we're really taking away from this experience is this real belief, as you put it, that, even though they might be extremely rare, we do have to think through and prepare for these kinds of shocks and construct resilient systems so that we're not caught so off guard in the future.
So where there's a crisis, there's an opportunity. You've been doing your research globally, so perhaps you can shed some light on some of the best practices that you've seen and insight around who started up, who's kind of leading the way, and how preparing for back to school in the different forms. What's happening from your lens?
Well, you're absolutely right that it's a crisis and there's been a lot of hardship. But necessity really is the mother of invention. And we've seen, just enormous innovations, huge innovations, very promising, whether it be from individual teachers, students, parents, all different stakeholders suddenly finding themselves in a new position and with a new set of rules. And we're seeing, everything from governments and internet platforms and telecommunications providers working together to, build and bridge access issues, to, hands-on skill building for teachers, to actually learning support and also, of course, emotional well-being support for students, because this, at the end of the day, is a traumatic event, and students need psychological support as much as they need academic support.
That's a really good point about social emotional learning and the challenge of maintaining that and providing that support. Hence, our minister in Ontario, Lecce, announced 2 weeks ago he was going to require that all the teachers engage in synchronous learning over the weekend without any consultation, which caused a bit of a Twitter storm and Fire Lecce hashtag. How important is it to engage the stakeholder community in any major provincial or national or country planning process?
I think what we're seeing is that, what a crisis does is it shows the strengths, but it also is a stress test for all the weaknesses. And so in systems where there's very high levels of trust, like Norway, for example, where there's very high levels of trust, not just between the ministry and the teachers, but also between the teachers and parents and families.
Amazing.
They were actually able to do more things a little bit quicker with a little bit less consultation because they were building and basing it on that trust. But the trust had been built up from decades of consultation. So they were in a different position than a system which has had less trust or less consultation, and there's less of a starting point where you can operate together. And that's always a tension. There will always be a tension between getting everyone on board and the speed at which you can make a decision. So these are all trade-offs that need to be considered in any circumstance.
A very wise deputy minister from Halifax last summer shared a quote during our C21 CEO Academy Summit, that innovation happens at the speed of trust. And I don't know how in education, I don't know how many times I've used that this past year, because it's so true.
Yeah.
And we are challenged nationally in Canada with education being a provincial jurisdiction. And so we've got 10 provinces, 3 territories, as you know. Are you hold 2 passports? Are you a Canadian?
Just one, actually, just Canadian.
Excellent. I had mine stolen in Miami at a conference back in January at a conference. And ironically, I said to my wife, I said, I'm not in a rush to replace because I'm not traveling for a couple of months. And then COVID hit. So it's just bizarre coincidences that have happened since that time. But at any rate, we are duplicating. There's a lot of duplication happening and a lack of collaboration. And I almost feel as though this is an opportunity to redefine education in our country and what some of the priorities are. Are you seeing that happening in other countries? Because we don't have a representative per se at the table, for a lot of global initiatives, because they can't decide who it's going to be, or they might designate someone through the council ministers.
Well, Canada is represented. Canada is one of the few countries in our governing board that has 2 seats at the table, in fact.
Excellent.
A provincial representative from the council, that's usually a deputy minister of education. Right now, it's the deputy minister of education in Alberta. Previously, it was from New Brunswick, and as well as somebody who comes from SHRC, which I think the acronym has changed recently, but the skills.
Yeah, I attended a workshop they invited me up to in Ottawa.
Yeah. So
Excellent.
Canada actually has proportionally
Fantastic.
more representation.
Good news to hear.
Canada is definitely represented in our international conversations. And I have to say that Canada is really considered by many to be a great example of how you can have a very different, diverse set of students and stakeholders and really try and work together in a constructive way to, really putting students at the center and really working to better learning as the end goal of the education system, rather than perhaps getting caught up in more politics or more discussions which at the end don't really serve. One of your quote on trust, I loved it, by the way. It made me think of another quote on trust, which is my favorite quote, which is, trust arrives on foot, but it leaves on horseback. And I think that is extremely useful to remember, because
powerful.
You build trust, right? It's a deliberate process, and it takes a long time, but it can be broken quickly. And that's something that I think we need to keep in mind. And when we're seeing reactions now from all the countries, with 38 member countries, what we're seeing, of course, is an immediate crisis response, which is the here and now. It is not particularly strategic. It's really about limiting damage and keeping people safe and healthy. And now what we're seeing as schools are reopening is a little bit more time to step back, to think, okay, what do we have to do in 6 months? What do we have to do in a year? What are our opportunities to rethink, redo, rewire, as you were suggesting? Because thinking of that takes time, actually, and you need to recover from that first shock in order to take that step back. But we're starting to see that now.
Fascinating. Thank you for that. I'm intrigued by your reference to students being at the center, and I feel as though they've been forgotten oftentimes in the conversations. And what is it they want? And, we give kids more credit than ever before and more agency. They're smarter than ever before compared to when we were in school, because we challenge them. And I'm impressed that you've sought their insight. And I listened to one of the podcasts where it was students and globally talking about what they'd like to see school look like in the future. Perhaps you could shed some light around that and how this has impacted students' thinking in the future, because unfortunately some kids are going to enter their last year of high school or the first year of high school or first year of university online, which is not my daughter's in her final year this fall online, and she's not happy about that.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, you know, so I'll speak in averages to start, but I do want to put up a flag for the kids who are most vulnerable, because I think that even though we're increasingly including voices of students in the discussion, it's always the most vulnerable and the hardest to reach who are still not being heard. I mean, they're the hardest to get to the table, and in many ways they're the ones we have to listen to most carefully. But going back to sort of what has worked well, which is really getting the student voice and listening to that voice, not just asking, but listening to it. I think it's quite clear. I mean, an immediate reflex for many students of all ages was to be very excited that school was out. You know, in France, they showed videos of the whole room erupting when President Macron declared the schools were closed. But over the weeks, then when the weeks went to months, you see a growing acknowledgement by not just parents, but also students that school is more than a building. You know, it's where they see their friends. It's the social fabric of communities. It's how they live their lives. And so there's the concerns about academic progression for many, and then there's just very real concerns about well-being and having fun and being able to hang out with your friends, which is an incredibly important part of school and growing up. So I think that, you know, one of the things is listening to that and respecting that, you know, a lot of our discussion has been about maintaining academic levels, and that's incredibly important. But I think we also have to acknowledge the importance of the social and the sort of relational ties that we see with schools. And that's what students are also telling us is really important for them.
Well, I like to say it's never been a more exciting time to be in education. And then I multiply that by 10 now after COVID. Any final thoughts to share, being mindful of your time and the day?
Yeah, and thanks so much for this opportunity to have this chat. It's been really fascinating. I think one thing that for me I'd love to think about more, and I will be thinking about more, is how we can really balance the power of technology. We've seen it, you know, we've seen all the ways which we can sort of innovate teaching and learning through technological means, with what we've really come to realize is our, you know, the power of the physical world, that we are physical beings, and we need to balance that in some way going forward. And that, I think, is one of the things that I'm most excited about seeing play out and seeing the choices countries make. I think there's a lot of endless opportunity and exciting moments through that.
With that, thank you so much. Being kind and compassionate today has never been more important. That was Dr. Tracey Burns, Senior Analyst of the Directorate for Education and Skills at the OECD. My name is Robert Martellacci, the MindShare Learning Report and C21 Canada, Canadians for 21st Century Learning Innovation. Be sure to check out www.MindShare Learning to get your latest issue. And until next time, stay healthy, stay safe, and keep the learning curve steep.